Hey, aloha Friday, and welcome to Stand the Energy Man for the 22nd of January. I'm wearing my full HCAT battle regalia here because I just came from the state capitol with the Hawaii Energy Policy Forum, where I try and help sit down with all the other folks that from the community and from the stakeholders in energy in Hawaii to look at different policy that maybe we can get the legislature to look at. We've got part two today of the show with Paul Pontio's tour on the Big Island. I hope you enjoyed Dr. Baker last week with Rachel. This week we're going to pick up and go with Paul Pontio's tour again. And I'm going to try and spend a little bit more time introducing some of the sections because Paul talks about them, but I want to emphasize some things. So he starts off just after he talks about the stationary fuel cells he uses at Blue Planet at his research facility. He talks about a fuel cell that's used in a forklift. Now, this is a fuel cell that was given to him. It's actually surplus from the U.S. Army that we got, and I think H&EI gave this one to Paul. And the fuel cell is a 13 kilowatt fuel cell, which is about half the size of what I put in my vehicles, the big vehicles at Hickam. But 13 kilowatts is a pretty decent fuel cell. It'd get a car going pretty well. So it's from a forklift, but it's about the size you'd see in a car. And the super capacitors that Paul talks about is when you need an extra boost of power from your batteries, sometimes it helps to have even a little bit bigger boost. So there's super capacitors and a battery alongside this fuel cell that's in the forklifts. And he keeps the whole thing intact, and when you see it, he'll talk a little bit about it. But you still need a battery. That's the important part. A lot of times when people listen to me talk about fuel cells, they think I don't like battery vehicles or plug-ins. Batteries are a big part of fuel cell electric vehicles, and they're critical to make the power smooth and react fast enough, and that's true on the grid as well. So this particular mock-up that he's looking at, just to give you a way to think about it, it can do about 35 kilowatt hours worth of power. So that tells you that like the average house in Hawaii probably does between 20 and 30 kilowatt hours a day. So just this little fuel cell with its 2 kilograms or so of fuel can run your house for a day, to give you an idea how much this little portable unit is that he's talking about. Another thing that we don't talk about much because we live in Hawaii and it doesn't get very cold is people think that, well, a fuel cell, because it produces water and stuff, it's probably going to freeze up if you put it in a cold climate. And actually, nothing could be further from the truth. A lot of people think that batteries would work great because, you can use a battery anytime. However, we don't live in a cold place. And if those folks that live in the great north frozen tundra of North America or up in Alaska know that in the dead of winter, when it's down sub-zero, 20, 30 degrees below zero, try and start your car up and it ain't moving. Not only is the fluids in the car kind of getting thick, but like the oil and everything, but the power that comes out of your battery is greatly diminished when it's cold. However, a fuel cell, when you start it up, initially it starts kind of slow, but as it starts going, it builds some internal heat, warms itself up, and becomes efficient right away and works really well. So don't just think about fuel cells as a fair weather piece of equipment to generate electricity. It's actually very, very efficient. Another thing that's going to come up right after he looks at that fuel cell is a leaf blower. Now this is a leaf blower right out of Home Depot or Lowe's or wherever, and all he did was he converted it to run off hydrogen. And that's really kind of tricky because a lot of people that have used hydrogen as a fuel before in internal combustion engines, they tend to just put the fuel in there and run it the way a gasoline engine would, and it doesn't really work very efficiently because hydrogen can have a lot of energy in it, but it's so fluffy. You have to put compressed hydrogen in to get all the BTUs, all the energy out of it. And most people just put room temperature, room pressure hydrogen in, and you don't get a whole lot of bang for the buck in an internal combustion engine that way. But there's reasons for thinking about hydrogen as a fuel in internal combustion engines because, and this is a point that Paul makes, there's 1.2 billion internal combustion engines out there. And instead of trying to think of converting to fuel cells all at once, we ought to be thinking about converting to some of these engines, maybe a lot of them, especially diesel high compression engines, to run off hydrogen so that they can actually make the air cleaner after it comes out of the exhaust than when it went into the engine. So without further ado, we're going to hit Paul Pontio's tour, pick it up again, and start looking at the internal combustion engine and start off with the fuel cell that he got from a forklift.
So the fuel cell forklift that we saw out there, this is what's inside. This is what's inside the Gen drives and the Nuvera drives. this is without the 3,000 pounds of cast iron ballast around it. So in order to match the weight of a lead acid battery pack they put in electric forklifts, they have to add 3,000 pounds of cast iron for ballast. The fuel cell itself only weighs a few hundred pounds with all the components. And it's a carbon fiber wrapped tank. This is a 11 kilowatt stack or 13 kilowatt stack. So you can see how compact this stack is, but it's made up of lots of little membrane electrode assemblies all the way through to get the voltage and to get the, some of them are wired in parallel so that they produce just the 53 volts, but more kilowatts. And then they go into a bank of super capacitors which act like a battery. Because fuel cells, a lot of people don't understand, fuel cells don't respond instantaneously. They have to spool up. So it takes a few minutes from being cold for it to reach peak power. Some take 20 minutes. But the way the forklifts work and where the cars are going to work is they have either a lithium battery in line that acts as that shock absorbent, the buffer. And here they use supercapacitors, which are similar to batteries, but they can deliver huge amounts of current to get a 10,000-pound forklift moving. And then the fuel cell catches up and tops them off and keeps them charged. So, and fuel cells are getting more and more quiet as they get better compressor technology, or they get compressorless fuel cells that can use ambient air temperature or air pressure. But this should start up in some. So when it's running at full power, this is what it sounds like. And it's just a big fan and the compressor making the noise. So it can get pretty loud when it's out of its case and it's inside the building like that. But again, it's just the stack itself makes no sound at all. It's just forcing the air through to make up the difference between the hydrogen and the oxygen in the air. So this one we took apart just to be able to display and show people what the components are, and it becomes a little portable generator. Since it has its own 2.2 kilogram tank, you can get about 30 to 35 kilowatt hours of power out of this.
Wow.
So that's pretty nice. So it's a good backup. And you saw the nozzle over there. That goes right onto the male nipple on here. And that's how you fill it. And they both have check valves, so it's just whatever one has more pressure. Well, it can only flow one way, but it's a pressure differential, the way that it works. So it'll fill that tank until it equalizes with the pressure on this side, and then it's done. So these make really good repurposed backup generators. And our whole concept is to not use fossil fuels. So even though we have a big diesel generator as a last resort fail-safe, we try not to run it at all except to exercise it now and then. So the hydrogen becomes the backup to the batteries, and then you're fossil fuel free, 100%. And if you're making the hydrogen from solar or wind or a renewable resource, then it's really, really clean, green hydrogen. So that's two of the things we can do with it. We can use it for mobility. We can use it for stationary power back into electrons again. You can run an internal combustion engine on it, and you can cook with it. It's great for cooking, and we'll show you these here. Let's look at the engine first. Okay, this is an off-the-shelf leaf blower from Home Depot. This is the gasoline version. This is the hydrogen converted version. And hopefully it's not going to get the right one. So if you've ever started a gas motor, whether it's propane or anything like that, it usually takes several choking attempts and adjustments to get it to actually start running and warming up. Hydrogen doesn't have that limitation. It will start in the first place. All I did was purge some of the hydrogen out so it didn't backfire. Start on the first one. This is the exhaust you're breathing right now. Water vapor in there. Even when you burn it, there's no pollution. In fact, it's cleaning the air, because the air going in is dirtier than the exhaust. So all the allergens and pathogens and dust, everything gets consumed and converted by the hydrogen combustion.
No runny nose.
We need that.
Sophia's had a runny nose all day today,
Yes.
until
And
now.
this one here, of course, if we ran it, we'd be choking in about 30 seconds inside the building. So the conversion, this is the simplest form of conversion. It's basically just unthrottled. And all we do is take the carburetor off in the fuel tank and then drill a small hole where the intake valve is on the cylinder head inside. And then we change the timing of the engine to what's called top dead center, so that instead of igniting as it's compressing the fuel to get it up to ignition temperature, that's how a normal engine works with normal fuels. Hydrogen will ignite and combust so quickly that you want to ignite it at the top of the piston stroke when it's coming down. So it's all power, and you're not creating back work against yourself.
So how did you change the timing?
The timing on this one, this one actually has a timing belt. So all I did was take the belt off and slip it a few teeth until it was top dead center.
There you go, okay.
Now in a car, doing a vehicle conversion, you can do a much, much better job, because this is just magneto-fired, which means every 360 degrees it fires, and this is a 4-stroke engine, so it's actually wasting a spark on the exhaust stroke as well. So to get it to start, like any engine, you've got to have just the right mixture of hydrogen. If you have too much, it'll kick back because it's popping too fast. If you don't have enough, it won't fire. But once it's running, then you can throttle as much hydrogen. And instead of controlling the engine speed by throttling the amount of air that the engine can breathe, because you're starving it for air at that point, you control it by metering the amount of hydrogen that's flowing in. Now, a lot of people don't understand how engines work, but on a car, you basically have a vacuum inside the engine, and your carburetor allows more air and fuel to enter by moving the carburetor butterfly. That creates what's called a homogeneous charge combustion. The air and the fuel is mixed at just the right ratio, stoichiometric mixture ratio, to get the fuel to burn as cleanly as possible. Hydrogen, the best way to do it is actually to meter it, and it's called stratified charge combustion. So instead of having the air and the fuel mixed evenly, the air comes into the cylinder and this hydrogen shoots in the center. So what happens is that the cylinder walls around the piston are cushioned by air, and the ignition happens in the center of that. It keeps the heat from dissipating or radiating out to the cylinder walls as much, and it also causes a different type of combustion to happen inside. Because of the cooler temperatures, less or no nitrous oxides are formed. You need to get 2200 degrees to form nitrous oxide, and that's the biggest pollution. That's why you have catalytic converters on cars. It has to clean up the nitrous oxides from the fuel that doesn't burn completely, and from the high temperatures that take the nitrogen in the air and the oxygen and they combine it to NOx. So stratified charge combustion can actually not only produce no NOx, it'll actually remove NOx that's already in the air in the form of pollution, and it'll clean the air up even more. So why would we care about this when we have fuel cells? Okay, fuel cells are 2.5 times as efficient as internal combustion engines. A kilogram of hydrogen has the same amount of energy as a gallon of gasoline if you burn it, same BTUs. Fuel cell, you get 2.5 times the energy. So the Toyota Mirai, which holds 4 kilograms, that's the equivalent of 4 gallons of gasoline. You can get 310 miles of driving on 4 gallons of gasoline equivalent. Burning it, it's like 1-to-1. A kilogram of hydrogen is the equivalent of a gallon of gasoline if you burn it. So it's no more efficient than your engine and your car. Plus, you're dealing with a compressed gas fuel that's kind of a pain to deal with. The reason we want to do this is because right now there's approximately 1.2 billion internal combustion engines on the planet operating right now, polluting right now, running on diesel or any kind of hydrocarbon fuel. They're not going to go away anytime soon. I don't care how fast we can make fuel cells, we're still going to have a huge inventory of internal combustion engines. And they really work well. The only problem with internal combustion engines is that they pollute. And the efficiency is around 25%. on the conversion. The rest goes off in heat. But if you can capture that heat and use it for something, that adds to the efficiency level. But there's another way to run internal combustion engines off of a liquid carrier of hydrogen. And this is basically things like ammonia, which have lots of hydrogen in them. You can burn ammonia, and you're burning mostly hydrogen. It's fairly clean. Problem is ammonia is really nasty to deal with. Nobody wants to pour ammonia into their gas tanks and have to deal with it from day to day. It's very dangerous. Methanol, which is the simplest alcohol that you can make, is a good hydrogen carrier. And we have a friend, Roy McAllister, in Phoenix, who has patents on processes and blends of engineered fuels called Methanol. Now, they're basically methanol type fuels, but the beauty of methanol is that it can be made from a wide variety of feedstocks. You can take hydrogen and CO2, you take hydrogen and nitrogen, and other different combinations, and combine those, and it turns into a liquid. Same way hydrogen and oxygen turn into water. By combining hydrogen and nitrogen under the right conditions, it turns into methanol. So when you use that methanol in an engine with the right injectors to be able to ignite and meter it, and the equipment that takes it from a liquid to a gaseous state, then you're getting the same net effect of gaseous hydrogen in the engine from a liquid carrier that goes in a standard gas tank at room temperature and room pressure, ambient pressure. So that makes it simple because we already have an infrastructure to dispense that in normal gas stations. You already have cars that have poly gas tanks that could be filled with the Methanol. So by converting the injectors and changing the spark plugs and putting on a small piece of equipment that's a heat exchanger, you could convert an internal combustion engine to run on Methanol instead of gasoline. And now it becomes an air cleaner instead of a polluter. And it's an existing infrastructure that's everywhere on the planet. So that's why it's important to be doing more research on internal combustion and hydrogen. And right now we've got companies like Volkswagen, BMW, a few others that are actually developing internal combustion engines for hydrogen.
Hey, welcome back. We're getting ready for a break here, and thanks again to Paul Pontio for letting us tour his shop over there. We're going to be right back after a short break.
Hi, I'm Donna Blanchard. I'm the host of Center Stage here on Think Tech Hawaii. Center Stage airs every Wednesday at 2 o'clock, and of course you can check out our archives on YouTube or on Think Tech Hawaii anytime you like. Why should you do that? Because this is an arts show that I believe is making a difference in lives. We talk with artists of various ilk. We talk with painters and writers, playwrights, novelists, poets, sculptors, dancers, you name it, directors, actors, of course. And we don't only talk about what people do, but we talk about how they do it. And my favorite part of the conversation, we talk about why they do it. And it's really common on this show to hear people say, wow, I didn't think about it that way. And it's very common to hear people afterwards who have seen the show say the same thing. And I hear all the time that people are inspired by the conversations that we have. So why don't you join us and be inspired too? That's Center Stage on Wednesdays at 2 o'clock. We'll see you Center Stage.
Hey, welcome back to Stand Energy Man on my lunch hour. So there's going to be a test, stratified charge, homogeneous charge, top dead center. You got to remember all that stuff. It's important. But Paul has some pretty good insight, and he travels a lot, and he's got some folks that visit him from all over the world. There's a lot of interest in this stuff, and we'll learn some more in the second segment. This next video clip coming up, he starts to talk. It's actually a repeat from the last show, but I wanted to emphasize some things, and this is really one of the most important things that I get from visiting Paul's shop every time, and it's hydrogen safety. And some of the things I want to emphasize is the fact that hydrogen, if you just had a balloon of hydrogen and you popped it, and that volume of hydrogen took off, it would be 6 stories away from you in 1 second. Hydrogen just is extremely fast at normal air pressure at sea level. It'll just take off like crazy. 45 miles an hour it moves up. So it doesn't really have time to mix with air. So when we talk about hydrogen safety, we really need to think about whether we're talking about pure hydrogen, like we use in the vehicles, which is, we call it 5 nines, 99.999% pure, virtually pure hydrogen, which is what we store in our tanks, or we're talking about mixes of hydrogen. A lot of times when you look at YouTube, you'll see guys making hydrogen different ways, and a lot of times they're collecting the hydrogen gas and oxygen at the same time in the same compartment. That's an explosive mixture. When you have an oxidizer with the hydrogen, you have a flammable slash explosive mixture. So a lot of the people that think that hydrogen explodes is because they're looking at people that are not separating the hydrogen out, and Paul talks a little bit about that, but that's a real critical point that you need to know. The heat is moist heat, it's different, it doesn't radiate. In fact, I put my hand right next to the burner for like 20, 30 seconds, and literally my hand is only maybe a quarter of an inch away from that flame on the side, and I don't get burned. I'm not even getting hot. And I could have left it there for a whole 20 minutes if I needed to, and you'll see that on the video. Another thing we talk about is that the flame is colorless. If you look on the internet, it'll say hydrogen's colorless when it's burning. Well, that's true outside. It's really hard to see the flame outside. But if there's any kind of contamination, like it's burning paint on the side of something while it's burning, it'll have a color. Indoors, it has an orange color. At night, it has an orange color. So it does have a color, but it is odorless. And so people say, well, why don't you put some kind of smell in it so if it's leaking, you can smell it. As soon as you put anything into the hydrogen, you start to introduce problems in a fuel cell using it. They haven't quite found that odorizer yet that gives you the sense of smell that'll say it's a leak. But usually hydrogen leaking is not a big problem, and Paul will talk a little bit about that. So he'll talk at the end here about some projects they have going on in other parts of the world using hydrogen not as a fuel in a fuel cell, but actually as a combustible fuel, like in the internal combustion engines that he showed. So we'll start up again with Paul's tour here as he talks about hydrogen safety and fire safety.
Dispel some of the myths about hydrogen, because most people are afraid of hydrogen. Most people think it's the most explosive thing on the planet, and that if you have a small leak in a hydrogen system, then it's just destined to explode and burn the building down. Well, the reality is that since it's the lightest element in the universe, it's 14 times lighter than air. It goes up at 45 miles an hour when it's let loose. That's 66 feet a second. So think about it going 1,001 and it's 6 stories away of it. It's gone. And because of that, it's very difficult to get a concentration that's flammable at the source of a leak unless you're right at the leak source. And what we do in the classroom is we do it by showing this. So you got a really audible major leak of hydrogen. It's blowing out right now like crazy. And most people would think if there's a spark, it's going to blow up. Well, it'll blow the flame out if I get close enough to it right now. It won't ignite until I get down closer to where it's concentrated enough. But as it's leaking out, it's hitting the ceiling of this building and it's going out that vent. So before I lit it, the hydrogen that had leaked out had already left the building. It's gone. It's moving really, really fast. So the other cool thing about hydrogen is that since there's no carbon in it, it's just purely hydrogen. And it's a little windy in here. But there's no radiant heat. And because of that, you can put your finger about 1/8 inch from the flame and there's no heat. It won't burn. But above right here, it's 500 degrees plus. It's very hot. And if you come here, you can actually put your hands over it, you can feel the humidity in the flame because it's making water vapor with the oxygen in the air. I'll turn it down a little bit. The other thing is the other big myth or misunderstanding, it's not a myth, is that hydrogen is invisible when it burns. Well, it is outside. So if we took this in the sunlight, you wouldn't see the flame. But indoors and in subdued light, it burns orange. At nighttime, it burns bright orange. Yeah, I mean, I can get really, really close. And this tubing will it's actually colder than room temperature right here. It's hot by the jet, but it's pulling the heat out of the air and cooling down. And this is a little carbon fiber tank. We used to run this off of a propane tank, which was kind of bulky and a pain. This holds twice as much hydrogen as that 5-gallon tank, but it's at 4,500 psi. And it's actually a paintball tank.
And you said it was how much? 100 and what? $100? How much?
Yeah, about 100. With the regulator, it's about $125, $130. So they have a nice miniature regulator. This is a super low pressure one that puts out 275 psi, which is very close to the propane tank. Yeah, you can feel the moisture. And I used to have a pot to show. But what's cool about that is if you barbecue with it, it doesn't dry your food out. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
The other thing to notice about the lack of radiant heat, the significance of it is that if you have a fire at a fueling depot where you've got lots of hydrogen tanks stored, they're not going to heat each other up and start cascading into an explosion. It's just going to go up and burn itself out. And that's usually the preferred method of dealing with the hydrogen fire. Just let it burn out. Put it out with water or something else like that, then you've got hydrogen gas ready to ignite again. So you don't want to do that. Just let it burn out. And the cars and trucks all have a thermal release valve that'll basically dump all the contents in less than a minute. So if it senses enough heat, it'll actually open the vent and let it really, but the heat goes straight up.
So if you had a hydrogen leak in a set of tanks, it would be more like a torch than
Like a
a
torch.
billowing flame.
Right.
And so probably that torch would be a foot or so above the tank.
Yes.
By the time the air mixture is right to ignite, and so it would actually be above the tank with no radiating heat, so much safer than.
Yeah, there's a famous video on YouTube that shows a hydrogen fire coming out of a fuel cell leak on a car right out of the trunk. And the windshield rubber on the back didn't even get melted or burned. Right. And you can see that here. And to demonstrate it more, this has got half the time that this has on it, but it was used with propane. So you can see how oxidized the finish is on that. This is virtually new. And there's a lot of it can get really hot. So it's hotter than propane. And the conversion is simple. It's just a tubing with holes in it. There's no pre-mixture of the air, no jetting involved. And this little tank here will cook for about 1 hour with this burner right here. And it takes about less than 5 seconds to refill it on our filling station.
I think that might be one of our ready for market type of things, is a quick little barbecue that goes out to.
And these
Because look
are
how
great.
light that is compared to a
I
heavy
know.
metal barbecue grill and stuff.
Yeah, and dragging down a
Yeah.
5-gallon, there's 50 grams of, 25 grams of hydrogen in here, which is no weight at all. It's less than an ounce. The rest of it's just the steel. So this just weighs a few pounds. It's really light, and it goes with the burner. So you could have actually 3 of them, one on each leg, and get 3 hours of cooking. Go to the beach.
And you can buy that canister from any paintball.
Amazon.
You're saying it burns hotter than propane, so you wouldn't need to cook things as long.
Right, that's the other thing too. And plus it also puts the heat right where you want it. So you're not heating up the room unnecessarily, you're just cooking the food.
And you don't have carbon monoxide issues if you're cooking inside, or if you're in enclosed, like people in the cold climates that are like using space heaters and
Yeah.
stuff.
Or even people in rural communities who are
Yeah.
burning wood and
Yep.
poisoning their families in their huts.
So we're actually working on a project we call it the Bhutan stove, because it's originally intended for the people in Bhutan. And the idea is to come up, because they use wood or they use propane. So propane's really expensive. India controls all of their fuel. So it costs a lot for them, and it hits the poor people the hardest. They also have to trek by horseback to the village to go get their tanks filled up and bring them back. Or they scavenge and burn up all their wood resources. Now, this is a huge problem in Haiti and Africa and all them developed nations. People die from wood smoke inhalation. It's something like 500 and something people every hour on the planet are dying from carcinogenic stuff and smoke and noise. So hydrogen is a good solution for that if we can come up with an economical stove. Now, the idea is to take a small electrolyzer like this one here. This is actually a little electrolyzer stack. It can actually be smaller. And that would run off of one single solar panel out in the sun. That would make hydrogen, and you could use both the oxygen and the hydrogen if you did it on demand and didn't try to store it. Storing HHO, which is what comes out when you mix the gases back together. Storing it and pressurizing it is really dangerous. A lot of guys on YouTube have blown up their cars, because they didn't know what they were doing. Storing pure hydrogen is really safe because it won't ignite if there's no oxygen in there, no air. So you can compress hydrogen all you want all day long, and it's really, really safe. So the other way is to actually, so you could do it with HHO by combining the two and only having it generate the stuff on demand as you turn the stove on. So you're not storing any big amounts. It'd be a little tube full of hydrogen and oxygen. And you could keep them separated so they only combine right at the point of the burner, and then it's even safer. The other way is to take and just let the oxygen vent, or if you got some fish, aquaponics, you pump it into that. To take the hydrogen and store it into a low-cost system. Now this can actually pressurize this up to about 120 psi. So about half of what it could hold at 250. The other way is to use a low-cost storage, and we're looking at these accordion-shaped butyl rubber tanks that collapse flat. So they have an aluminum plate on both ends. As you fill them, they expand like an accordion. And then when you use the gas, the weight of it just compresses and squeezes it out. Because you don't need real high pressure. Again, 10 pounds per square inch is probably plenty for cooking. And that's real safe, inexpensive storage.
Yeah. That technology is used in anaerobic digesters with methane too.
Yeah, methane would be great. I mean, you burn that, you're still just releasing CO2, but it's better than having the methane just go off into the air. But if we can get a low-cost, mass-produced small electrolyzer, a solar panel, a storage, and a simple stove, that could replace the propane and the wood-burning stoves that people are using and dying from.
Okay. Hey, welcome back to Stan the Energy Man. So, you actually saw us burning some hydrogen and some safety issues with it, but it's actually pretty versatile as a fuel and also in fuel cells. So after this break, we're going to come back and talk about some of the different ways you can use hydrogen.
Hi, I'm Ethan Allen. I'm the host of Likeable Science on Think Tech Hawaii. We talk about why people should like science, why science is actually fun, how science is a dynamic and vital part of everyone's life, why everyone, every man, woman, and child on the planet should really know science, should love science, should be familiar with science. So it's a great show. People come on here and have interesting conversations with us. They tell us why they do what they do, why they love it, why we should love it too. I hope you'll join us every Friday, 1 to 2 p.m. And of course, you can see it anytime on YouTube. Aloha.
Hey, welcome back, and thanks again to Paul for giving us a tour of his shop. So today we've learned about fuel cells, and we've also seen how you can burn hydrogen in a regular wok burner, and that can be done in a stove or a water heater or any of a number of places. In fact, there's a couple of culinary schools on the mainland that have converted to hydrogen as their fuel instead of natural gas or propane because of the qualities that Paul talked about, like a moist heat when you're directly broiling something, and the directional heat. It's actually controlled much more effectively using hydrogen. So some of the things that we're looking at besides stoves and the gas, the leaf blowers on the internal combustion side are fuel cells. So this next segment starts off with Paul showing you actually what happens in my business when I make the hydrogen from electricity and water, and I turn it into hydrogen gas and oxygen gas, and then I put the hydrogen in a fuel cell vehicle and run the vehicle. He's got a great little model that shows what you'd call soup to nuts in the hydrogen fuel cell world. And so we'll get a chance to look at that. But when we do the vehicles, it's always at fairly high pressure, 10,000 PSI. My trucks work at 10,000 or 5,000 PSI, and most of the vehicles, like the Mirai and the Hyundai vehicles and the Honda vehicles, they all work at 10,000 PSI. That's pretty high pressure. But at home, you don't have to work with high pressure. You know, Paul talked in the last segment about how when they have the Bhutan project, you can just store the hydrogen at just above ambient pressure, so maybe 15, 20 psi, and then and store it at your house fairly low pressure, and then maybe get a small pump that puts it into your car and pumps the pressure up while you're sleeping at night. And there's actually a model I've talked about with Jay on one of the energy shows where in Hawaii, if you have a fuel cell car and you have PV on your roof, you just come off the grid, make your hydrogen during the day when you don't need a lot of electricity, come home at night, plug your house into your car and run your house off of your car, and then fill your car up with the hydrogen that you made all day, and now you don't have a fuel bill for your car and you don't have an electric bill for your house. So I'm hoping that's what the future brings us to. So anyway, last segment here gives you an example of some more fuel cell technology.
This is a cool little model that demonstrates everything that we've been looking at on the electrical side, right? We got an electrolyzer, we have real fuel cells over here. This is a scale version of just that. This is an electrolyzer. So electricity is splitting water into hydrogen and oxygen. They're going to recombine in a fuel cell and make DC electricity. So you'll see in a second when the oxygen catches up, because it's 1/3 of this, it takes a minute, is half as many, or twice as many bubbles of hydrogen as there are oxygen, because it's H2O, right? So 2/3, 1/3. They're going to recombine in the little PEM fuel cell and make DC electricity. So electricity in, you split water into two gases. When you combine the gases, you get water and electricity out. It's the exact opposite of electrolysis.
So this is an exact scaled down version of our station and a car. The making the hydrogen on the left side and the fuel cell in the vehicle on the right side giving you power to your axles.
Yep. And the only emissions is water.
How do you put water back into that fuel cell?
These,
Okay,
yeah, we just fill up the tanks.
all right.
So it's doing this on less than 5 volts and less than 2 amps or 2.5 amps of power. And if it were outside, these little panels would drive it as well.
There's a fuel cell on both sides?
Well, they look like they're the same. When you have a small scale
Electrolyzer.
PEM fuel cell, it can actually be an electrolyzer or a fuel cell, right? In this case, this one's larger because we're trying to produce enough gas to be able to create the voltage in the fuel cell. But it's basically a platinum electrode and 2 membranes. And there's enough, it'll run for 5 minutes or more now, just on a little bit of compressed gas and these things. Now the electrolyzer outside is an alkaline electrolyzer. And what that means is that the liquid inside the water it's an electrolyte. It has sodium hydroxide mixed in it. Now, the sodium hydroxide is lye. That makes the water more electrically conductive for it to be able to work properly. The biggest significant difference in Chris McWhinney's equipment and most alkaline electrolyzers is that most alkaline electrolyzers use 25 to 30% sodium hydroxide solution. His uses less than 1%. And it's the precision of the electrodes and the cell design that make it work that efficiently. This is using distilled water. There's no electrolyte in it. The water is the electrolyte.
So the closer you can get the plates and things in the membrane, the less electrolyte you should need.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of Chris's design.
Yeah. The other beauty is the methods they've come up with to keep the cost down. Most electrolyzers use membranes like Nafion from DuPont, which are very, very expensive. They're hundreds of dollars a square yard. They found something that acts as a diaphragm membrane that's about $6 a yard. And it's basically high-grade ripstop nylon. And they figured it out by thinking, well, what would keep two gases separated when it's wet? And, you know, pilots and Air Force wear ripstop flight suits and stuff, because if they go in the water, you could actually take your pants off, tie knots in the legs, grab air, and have a flotation device. So when it's wet, it's fairly impermeable. If pressure is equal on both sides, there's no reason for the gas to migrate across. So
And
it
the
works.
current can go back and forth
Yeah,
too.
so it works really well, yeah, the current works really, I mean, passes right through. But it's a very low-cost way, and it's actually more durable than Nafion. Nafion's fairly delicate, so it's an inexpensive, bulletproof, built-like-a-tank solution that they've patented. So this is
So, the takeaway from today's show is hydrogen. Is it safe? Yes, it's safe. As long as you know the rules, you handle it carefully. It's safe. Don't mix it with oxygen and expect it not to be flammable. But it's hard to mix with oxygen. It's great energy storage. In fact, that's a big takeaway. Hydrogen is just another way of storing energy, just like a battery and just like in regular fuel. Hydrogen doesn't have to be burned, but it can be burned. You can put hydrogen in a fuel cell and run it and turn it right into electricity on demand, or you can store it and burn it like a regular fuel and burn it on a walk burner like Paul did, or in a water heater or other things. You can even put it in an internal combustion engine if you change the timing of the engine and you change the way you inject the hydrogen to give you a stratified charge and give you a really good solid boost of hydrogen in your cylinder as an energy pressure generator as it expands out. So it's safe, it's reliable, it's transportable, it's a lot lighter than batteries. That's why they use it in cars, and that's why you don't see many big trucks running off just batteries. By the time you put enough batteries on a big truck, it weighs so much you can't put much more on it because it's too heavy to drive on the road. So hydrogen, if you haven't learned about it, learn some more about it. It's great stuff. And thanks again to Paul Pontio and the research guys at Blue Planet on Big Island. Outstanding job, and always good to go over and visit Paul. And I hope that all of you get a chance to go visit him sometime. I would invite you all to go over there personally, but he probably wouldn't appreciate it. But it's a great place to visit. Thanks again to Blue Planet. So until next week, Stan the Energy Man signing off. Aloha.